A poorly done repair causing the plane to lose its control and crash. Two planes colliding into each other due to pilot miscommunication. A very bad fog causing planes to crash into one another. Groups of terrorists hijacking two planes causing them to crash. For these are the worst plane crashes in human history. Starting off with the most notorious plane crash in history with the most fatalities and at the same time being the most life-changing one. American Airlines Flight 11 and United Airlines Flight 175, also better known as 9/11, starts off like this. It's morning, 8:25 a.m. where a group of air traffic controllers noticed something strange about Flight 175. Originally, the plane was headed from Boston to Los Angeles, but this plane goes silent and makes a hard unexpected turn towards the northeast. But what the air traffic controllers don't know is that it has been hijacked by Marwan al-Shehhi with 4 of his companions. Faiz Bani Hamid, Hamza al-Ghamdi, Ahmed al-Ghamdi, and Mohan al-Shehri. They're all dressed in American-style clothing, so they looked as normal as any other passenger. And on top of that, they all looked pretty physically unimposing, most of them being under 5'7". The only thing going for them is that they practice how to kill with their knives, slaughtering camels as practice where they were from. It was convenient for them since they were utility knives, and so they were allowed to bring them into the flight. Earlier, at 8 a.m. before they boarded the plane, another flight took off. Flight 11. That plane would also be hijacked by Marwan's associate, Mohammed Atta, who would also bring some companions as well. The hijacking of Flight 11 begins with Mohammed's companions cutting up to the front, incapacitating the pilots with their knives, presumably. Once they do this, they notify Mohammed to come up to the cockpit to fly the plane. As the air traffic controllers try to reach out of Flight 11, Mohammed shuts down the transponder. The air traffic controllers still try to reach out, but no result. As Mohammed is piloting the plane, he reassures everyone that it'll all be okay, telling everyone that they'll be going back to the airport.
We have some planes, just stay quiet and we'll be okay. We're returning to the airport. Nobody move. Everything will be okay. If you try to make any move, you'll injure yourself and the airplane.
At the same time, those words were also being transmitted towards Flight 175. At 8:41 a.m., the pilots hear that, and they told the air traffic controllers that they heard those life-threatening transmissions. And as they say that, those would be the last words heard from the pilots. At 8:46 a.m., Flight 11 flies closer toward New York City and crashes against the World Trade Center, going at 500 miles per hour, crashing on the 93rd floor. Between 8:42 and 8:46 a.m., that hijack attack in Flight 175 begins. As soon as the seatbelt light went out, al-Shehhi and Bani Hamid stormed toward the front of the plane, into the cockpit. Marwan then takes over the plane. He then makes a sharp left turn and starts climbing 3,000 feet higher up in the air within a minute. Around 8:55 a.m., the flight starts to make its descent, almost colliding into another plane. Right towards the end, the plane starts to descend 10,000 feet per minute. And then, at 9:03 a.m., the plane crashes on the 77th floor through the 85th floor on the South Tower. It killed everyone on board, 56 passengers, including the 5 hijackers, excluding the 9 crew members. The total fatalities were 65. The impact of the explosion caused hundreds of immediate deaths, and the collapsing of the tower killing thousands more. Tenerife Airport disaster, March 27, 1977. Planes involved: Boeing 747-121 and Boeing 747-206B. It's noon. The Pan American Flight 1736 is closing up on the Canary Islands. The flight is set to land in Las Palmas, which is a nice place in the Canary Islands where the plan is simple: to get off board of the plane and then go on a 10-day cruise. But what the people don't know on the plane is that there are terrorists on the Canary Islands. Long story short, the terrorists are determined to get their independence from Spain. Unfortunately, the terrorists picked Gondo Airport in Las Palmas, where the Pan Am plane will be arriving. Ahead of the flight is another plane, a jumbo jet from Dutch Airlines KLM, containing 234 passengers. That flight is also heading to Gondo Airport. Suddenly, at Gondo Airport, a terrorist bomb explodes. As the KLM flight requests approach, they are denied due to the terrorist bombing, and then are told to go to Rodeos Airport. Flight 1736 also requests for an approach, but then again, they also are denied because of the terrorist attack, recommending them to go to the same airport as the KLM flight, which was in Los Rodeos Airport on the Tenerife Islands. There would be multiple jumbo jets going to Los Rodeos Airport. At the same time, the Pan Am plane would begin its descent and land on the runway. Before that, the Dutch plane already descended on the runway and began to let the passengers out. The Pan Am decides to open the doors as well, unless the passengers go outside to take a walk. But as the passengers begin to get off the plane, they notice the sky starts to dampen, fog, darken. Shortly after Gondo Airport reopens, the planes are now able to make their way over there. They get permission. The KLM pilot wants to refuel before going back to Gondo Airport, since they want to have enough fuel to go back to Amsterdam where the plane is originally from. The KLM is now refueled and ready to begin leaving. The Pan Am was as well leaving, trailing them from behind. The plan is simple: for the KLM to keep going straight and make a U-turn, going full speed so they can take off. Now this is what ends up happening. The Pan Am here's the air traffic controller's instruction, which is them taking the C3 as the exit, but they instead thought it was C4 since they were already past C3. So as they're closing up on the C4 exit, about to make their turn, the KLM plane finishes its 180-degree turn and awaits ATC clearance, which is authorization by the air traffic control for the purpose of preventing collisions. But even if they get ATC clearance, they cannot take off. And as minutes passed, the KLM pilot grew impatient and decided to take off anyways. As time went on, the planes grew closer, to the point where they were within a kilometer of distance. The KLM pilot noticed that the Pan Am was still turning on its exit, but the pilot, out of desperation, started to try taking off, scraping the plane's tail on the runway in the process. As the pilot tried taking off on the runway, there wasn't enough space to take off properly, so the KLM unfortunately collided with the Pan Am, killing everyone on board on the KLM and killing around 80% of the passengers on the Pan Am. Total fatalities were 583, which included both crew members and passengers from the Pan Am, as well as all the people on the KLM flight. Japan Airlines Flight 123, August 12, 1985, Tokyo, Japan. The problem began first off in 1978 when Flight 123 suffered a tail strike landing at Osaka International Airport. The pilot lands the airplane with its nose too high up, scraping the tail up against the runway. Now, when they tried repairing it after the incident, they only used a single row of rivets instead of using a double row of them. The flight was only supposed to last 10,000 flights with that sort of repair. Instead, it lasted 12,317 flights. And unluckily, the people aboard on August 12, 1985 were the last ones being the 12,318th. It's now the day of the incident, 7 years later after the initial repair. 6:12 p.m. when Flight 123 began its takeoff. The flight was almost full, up to the brim, 509 passengers and 15 crew members. The flight starts at Haneda Airport and lands at Osaka Airport, which should be a 54-minute flight. As the plane goes up higher in altitude, it reaches a point where it could be on cruise mode. As this plane reaches this altitude, an explosion occurs, but nobody knows what's going on. The pilots believe it to be a door that fell out, but in reality, it was the rear pressure bulkhead, which is what stops the pressurized air from leaving the cabin out through the tail of the plane. Since the flight is up 7,300 meters up in the air is thinner and thinner, but the air inside the cabin is pressurized, suited for the passengers. The difference between that is that the passenger cabin side tail stretches and breaks. The air from the cabin is too much for the tail, and it breaks the tail, as well as the hydraulic lines. The plane cannot be controlled due to the loss in hydraulic fluid, broken tail, and rotors. The pilots try to control the plane, but they can't. Moving the levers is impossible without hydraulic fluid since they are just too heavy. The airplane enters a phugoid cycle. In simple words, the plane goes down, gathers speed, and then goes up, using the speed to go up, and it follows the same process. This goes on for around 30 minutes, until eventually the plane crashes into Mount Takamagahara. Out of the 524 people on board, 20 to 50 survived the initial crash. If it wasn't for the rescuers taking 12 hours to arrive, more people would have been saved. But because of that, only 4 people survived. Saudi Arabian Airlines Flight 763 and Kazakhstan Airlines Flight 1906, November 12, 1996. It's a busy day in Indira Gandhi International Airport. 6 years prior to that, India decided to make an open skies policy, which freed up air travel and increased international flights to and from India. The air traffic control system had much more pressure to deal with since there was much higher volume of air traffic. The even worse part about all of this is that the radar the air traffic controllers used at that time did not track altitude. They instead would write it on a strip of paper and keep updating the position as the pilots notified the controller. Now it's the day of the incident. It's past 6 o'clock. Saudi Arabian Airlines Flight 763 begins its takeoff. As it takes off, the approach controller begins to control the flight. What he needs to do is keep the planes spaced out safely apart, but not too far apart because they could cause a delay in arrivals and departures. As Flight 763 approaches 14,000 feet, they ask for permission if they could keep climbing up the altitude, but they are denied. They are not allowed to go any higher since another plane flying east, Kazakhstan Flight 1907, for a landing at Indira Gandhi International Airport. The controller's plan is for Flight 763 to pass thrust over flight 1907. Once that happens, he will let them continue going up higher in altitude. Now the requirements for this is 1,000 feet of distance and altitude from both flights. Instead, flight 1907 is at 14,100 feet, almost 1,000 feet lower than what it was assigned, and 10 feet below flight 763. At this point, planes are awaiting further instruction, and then suddenly, the planes hit each other, exploding, crashing into Khatri Datri, 7 kilometers away from each other. All of this happened due to pilot language barriers and outdated technology. Pilot language barriers because they just didn't understand English fluently and misunderstood 15,000 feet for 14,100 feet. The pilot who understood English corrected him too late. The outdated technology, since the radar that they had at the air traffic control only detected the position minus the altitude. As a result, they kept descending and crashed. Nobody survived out of the 349 passengers in both planes.